Before collecting gil ever became a problem, a little-known Japanese game company named Square was having financial troubles of its own. In 1987, they began facing off against another worldly evil known as bankruptcy. After only a few years of development by itself, and under the Disc Original Group collaboration, Square's bottom line was rocked by a string of unsuccessful titles, including The Death Trap, Cruise Chaser Blasty, Alpha, King's Knight, and an alien side-scrolling shooter. Even North American hits like Rad Racer and 3D World Runner were barely enough to keep the company afloat. With the resources for one last effort, Square's Director of Planning and Development, Hironobu Sakaguchi, was given the terrifying task of making a game that could save Square's dwindling future in the industry. When asked what type of game he would like to make, he replied, "I don't think I have what it takes to make a good action game. I think I'm better at telling a story." Taking cues from other RPGs on the market, from Japanese contemporaries like Dragon Quest and The Legend of Zelda, to stateside influences like Ultima, Sakaguchi dreamt up a video game with an immense world map to explore and an engaging tale to tell. Convinced the Famicom RPG would be his swan song, he ironically named it Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy was released for the Famicom on December 18, 1987, just 2 days before Sega's Phantasy Star. It was directed by Sakaguchi himself, with character designs by rising manga artist Yoshitaka Amano, and music by Nobuo Uematsu, a veteran video game composer who lent to the project his 16th video game score. It told the story of the four warriors of light, bearers of ancient elemental artifacts, and heroes destined to save the land from a growing plague. Despite crystals eventually becoming the central theme of the sprite-based Final Fantasies, the original quest involved retrieving 4 orbs. The only crystal mentioned in the English version was the wizard Matoya's missing eye. The plot sent the 4 light warriors to hunt down the 4 fiends, demons responsible for plunging the world into darkness. This led them to Lich in the Cavern of Earth, Keri in the Gurgu Volcano, Kraken in the Sea Shrine, and Tiamat, high above the Mirage Tower in the floating Sky Castle. But defeating these enemies only revealed a greater threat. They had collectively created the demon Chaos out of the corpse of Garland, the first boss you faced, and sent it back in time. After your team rewound the clock to face him, you learn that Chaos was the one responsible for sending the 4 fiends into the future, creating a cataclysmic and confusing paradox. Once Chaos was crushed, the world righted itself, and the heroes returned home. The story was epic for its time, but far from the gripping, dramatized narratives the series would eventually become known for. Instead, the focus was more on creating a deep, fulfilling, and highly customizable RPG gaming experience. You could name your characters, but with only 4 spaces available, you were essentially playing out one of 6 different archetypes: White Mage, Black Mage, Red Mage, Thief, Fighter, which later became Warrior, and Black Belt, which later became Monk, allowing for 30 possible group combinations. Your characters battled for money and experience points, powering up to a max level of 50. After a trip through the Castle of Ordeals and a visit to the Dragon King Bahamut, players could graduate their characters to superior jobs, including White Wizard, Black Wizard, Red Wizard, Ninja, Knight, and Master. These optional class upgrades were a first for the genre, and allowed the use of advanced spells and items. The majority of Dragon Quest and Ultima encounters were one-on-one, but in Final Fantasy, you could unexpectedly face off against up to 9 varied enemy types. These encounters were random, whether you accidentally stumbled across a band of wily imps or intentionally stepped forth to retrieve a sacred treasure. Most RPGs displayed their combat engine in first person, but Final Fantasy was the first game to show the heroes on the right side of the screen opposite their opponents on the left. That way you could visibly see who was attacking who on both sides. Primitive as they may appear now, Final Fantasy's battle animations were some of the most advanced graphical effects gamers had ever seen before. There were 8 levels of either black or white magic to learn, with 4 spells available within each. Mages could only learn 3 spells per level, forcing you to choose carefully. In an awkward time before mana or magic points, spells could only be cast if they had charges available. there were no ethers or elixirs, and only houses and inns restored charges. To see the world, players had to traverse an overworld map of 3 large continents, stopping to explore a multi-level dungeon, castle, cave, or rest at a friendly town's inn and shop at its stores. The planet-wide expedition became easier to manage once your party came in control of a boat, a canoe, and eventually an airship. The flying machine granted you complete access to the map without random enemy encounters, provided you could find suitable terrain to land on. The canoe and boat were both open to surprise attacks, but holding A and pressing B several times while out in the open sea started a 15-block minigame that rewarded you with a little extra cash. Final Fantasy had an extensive musical score for its day, with almost 20 different tracks playing out over the course of the game. Several of these would go on to become mainstays in the series, including the title screen arpeggio, the victory fanfare at the end of each battle, and the opening theme, which would evolve into an anthem for the entire franchise. Final Fantasy was not an easy game. You could only save in inns or by using houses, and doing so didn't remove status effects like poison. Fallen allies could only be revived with the White Mage life spell, or by using heart-shaped clinics, which were cross-shaped churches in the Japanese version. Enemies didn't drop items, and some of the later spells became insanely expensive. And then there were ineffective attacks, meaning if one of your party members killed an enemy before the others got a chance to take a shot at him, their moves, or even their magical charges, would be wasted. The monsters would also jump from being a walk in the park to a virtually impossible deathmatch at a moment's notice, and Square would tweak each upcoming sequel in an attempt to balance the overall difficulty level. Fans were willing to put up with the punishment though, because Final Fantasy became one of the most popular RPGs of the 80s, and one of the most successful titles on the Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System. It planted a seed that flourished into a lucrative series, one that as of last year had sold more than 68 million units worldwide. Final Fantasy has been repurposed for other consoles at least 7 times, more than any other role-playing game. These include the American port in 1990 and upgrades for the MSX, WonderSwan Color, PlayStation 1, Game Boy Advance, mobile phones in Japan, and last month, the PlayStation Portable, giving credence to Sakaguchi's crew that their fantasy was anything but final. Join us next Sunday for the second chapter in our 13-part Final Fantasy retrospective. In Part 2, we'll begin our journey down an unbelievably long list of RPG titles, starting with the 2 immediate sequels that wouldn't cross the Pacific until after the end of the century. One initiated a controversial leveling system, and the other you probably just played on the DS for the first time.